Welcome to SVHE's Chat with Change Agents. I'm your host for this conversation, Terry Shoemaker. For those of you who do not know me, I am a current board member of the SVHE and I'm a lecturer at Arizona State University's School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. Our Chats with Change Agent program is an opportunity for us to have a dialogue with innovators in higher education. And so today, even though I'm hosting, I would greatly encourage all of our participants to feel free to use either the chat box or the Q&A option in Zoom in order to communicate with us. And we have someone posted who will help us relay those questions to our guests today. This summer, we as a society have selected the theme of misinformation, disinformation, truth and untruth for us to discuss in the American society. This is such a timely project in thinking about a time when some are declaring fake news, the big lie, and other issues surrounding data and facts. So because of this, theme and because we're seeking to talk with innovators and leaders in fields, I am super excited to host a conversation today with two of my colleagues, Tracy Fessenden and John Carlson. Let me give our listeners just the briefest of introductions. Tracy Fessenden is the Steve and Margaret Foster Professor in Religious Studies at the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State University. And also joining us is John Carlson, Associate Professor at the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and the Interim Director at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. Both of them are greatly accomplished, and I might simply add that they are wonderful colleagues. And so welcome, Tracy and John.
Thank you, Terry.
Thanks, Terry.
So the center has began this project called Recovering Truth, and I'm just hoping to start with one or both of you, whoever's feeling it at this moment, can just give us a brief introduction to what that project is, and maybe discuss the energy behind that project.
Well, Terry, thank you for that lovely introduction. And you are just a fabulous colleague as well. So we're very happy to be here with you. And you were actually present at the birth of this project, unbeknownst to any of us at the time. But in the spring of 2017, you invited me to give a talk to the graduate students. And I chose as my theme the task of religious studies in an age of alternative facts, which was a term that we had just heard being thrown around. And my inspiration was a Time magazine cover that we saw that week or that month that asked the question in bold red letters on the cover of Time: is truth dead? And those of us in religious studies recognize that cover as the exact visual echo of an earlier cover from 1966 that asked, "Is God dead?" So, it just seemed a moment ripe for thinking and talking about our responsibilities to the truth in religious studies. Of course, in religious studies, we are always on the defensive because our colleagues say, well, you study all that crazy stuff. How can you justify giving all of that time and energy to crazy beliefs? We were in a moment when the imperative to tell the truth in public seemed to have been somehow vaporized, removed, and we were hearing all kinds of things in public from the highest office on down that were manifestly not true. And it seemed that we in the Academy in Religious Studies had an obligation to respond, but perhaps were ill-equipped to respond. It also seemed important for us as religious studies scholars to say what kind of care for the truth can we begin to nurture and cultivate and insist upon from ourselves and from others while at the same time not making a god of facts. We could turn everything over to the STEM disciplines, and that would be very, very important for certain problems, obviously. But it would not necessarily get us to the heart of the problem of why truth became optional in our public life, and why people are drawn to manifestly false accounts of reality.
If I were to add to that, I was also present at that lecture that Tracy gave. And sometime later, when we were putting together the proposal for this Recovering Truth project, which incidentally is funded by the Henry Luce Foundation, I was thinking back to that comparison and saying, I haven't read that article, Is God Dead? I've seen the cover. So I went back and read it. And one of the things we found when we went back and read that article compared to the stories in the Is Truth Dead piece is that there was just a vast difference in the kind of reporting that was undertaken for such a big topic, and the scope, the ambition, and it really brought to mind how much of our world has changed between the time that these two publications appeared. The world of media, of journalism has changed radically. Our world of politics has changed. The academy has changed. And we realized in looking at the Is Truth Dead, the robustness with which the truth was manifested was actually quite anemic. It was a very, very simplistic account of truth, in which it's about, it's all about facts. And I mean, I think the grand total of Donald Trump's lies during office totaled upward somewhere around 35,000 of them, right? But there's a way in which that kind of focus just on fact checking and reduction of truth to facts levels it all out. They're all kind of equal. One lie is as innocuous or as stupid or ridiculous as the next. And actually turns out that's not the case, because there was something called the big lie. And the big lie dwarfed all of the other ones. So we really started puzzling a lot over the differences in these two eras in which we are operating. At least these magazine covers came out, and these magazines in the stories, as well as thinking about what's our role as academics as we not only look at and analyze our culture, but participate in it. We are not outside of it in any way. And how can we make some contributions to that both leverage our academic understandings and knowledge, as well as show our commitment to the world in which we live. That's something that scholars have not always been able to navigate as seamlessly as we might assume we do.
Yeah, so both of you have already said quite a lot, John. I really like that idea of thinking about those two timepieces as markers that somehow symbolize something has shifted, something has changed. And I'm hoping, and I know this is I want to start broadly, I guess, in what we're talking about. But in the project thus far, and this is I guess a question that I've had. We keep referencing kind of certain things that's happened over the last 4 years, but have you all, as you've done this work, have you been able to identify kind of contributing factors that led up to kind of the big lie, so to speak, that we got to that moment? And what do those factors kind of look like? And again, I know I'm not expecting a comprehensive response, but just some of the contributing factors that you all have identified. And that's for either one of you.
Well, one of our big concerns is what our role in the academy has been to contribute to this post-truth environment. How have we been complicit in eroding the standing of truth and the care for and the standing of truth as an object of civic care? And when I think about that 1966 Time magazine cover, "The Death Is God Dead," the focus of the piece was on death of God theology. which was a very sort of energizing, exciting thing that was happening in a lot of seminaries, a lot of departments of religious studies. And it was sort of a sort of self-critical move in theology. And that was, as John was saying, I mean, it was not necessarily what people were talking about on the street, but the question of whether God is dead was a live question that this journalist did a wonderful, wonderful in-depth look at. The journalist really was doing what we would call now lived religion. You know, how are people experiencing this question, is God dead? So death of God theology in the academy really gave rise to some of the movements that later we grouped under the heading of deconstruction and postmodernism. And again, these were very energizing and clarifying. They made us, many of us who sort of cut our teeth on those movements in critical thought, became expert interrogators of truth claims. And we became suspicious. I mean, a suspicion was our mode of inquiry. I was noticing that now I've been looking at evangelical Twitter, and evangelicals who leave their church environment often refer to that now as their deconstruction. You know, they're in their period of deconstruction. And it's, of all the ways that deconstruction has entered into the lexicon, I think this is one of the most fascinating. It shows that this move can be very fruitful, right? And very searching. And can yield real change, because people talk about their deconstruction as very painful, but also as yielding a new relationship to authority, a new relationship to makers of truth claims who might not have been so trustworthy for that person in that person's community. So there was a lot of good that came out of that critical stance. Similarly, in religious studies, the traditional foci of theology, ethics, biblical or scriptural studies, sacred texts in whatever tradition, were joined by, and in many places dwarfed by, a new emphasis on lived religion, on anthropology of religion, where we never asked, is what you believe true, or does what you are doing religiously have any basis in objective reality? Those weren't the interesting questions. Those weren't going to get us to very full and empathic accounts of people's reality. But we were able, in both of those sort of critical moves, the turn to lived religion and the turn to postmodernism, to bracket truth in a way that may not have left us with the resources we need to confront this moment that we find ourselves in now. I was thinking about Harold Bloom's great book, The Book of J, about that strand in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that is so playful and so literary and so colorful. And it comes out of a period of relative prosperity that was not necessarily the voice to use during a period of exile or cataclysmic change. And so in the academy, similarly, I think we've had our J period, and we're moving into something that needs to be a little bit more grounded in the realities that we are dealing with now.
If I could pick up on a point that Tracy was making, I think it's facile to say that postmodernism is responsible for Donald Trump. So we don't want to go there. However, I do think we have to ask the question, do the movements associated with postmodernism and its rise in higher education give us the resources we need to counter what we have seen in a Trump era? And I think that gives us a very different kind of response. And that should lead us to some introspection, a little soul searching. And this concern with, what we can affirm, if we gave as much attention in our teaching, in our classrooms with our students, to what we can embrace, as much as what we can tear down, critique, condemn, I think we'd be in a much different kind of place. Because one of the things that seems striking to me is that in some ways, what one now sees on the right are the tactics and practices and moves that the left was criticized for many, many years. Moral relativism, the no belief in kind of moral clarity or objectivity, etc. And if one sort of side of the spectrum has largely abandoned that language, or had at one point, then when the other one, abandons it as well, what are you left with? And one of the things that's so deeply concerning to me, that is really evident of this kind of moment we're in, is that we've lost our vernaculars, our languages that cannot be simply reduced to politics in the crude partisan sense of the term. There is nothing that is not considered nonpartisan. Well, truth should be nonpartisan. Reality is nonpartisan. And we have to recover languages, ideas, frameworks, stances, perspectives, conversations that allow us to see that not everything is political in that regard. Not everything can be reduced to simply, oh, you're one of them, this tribe or that tribe. And again, this is a place where I think in higher education, in our schools, public schools as well, we can do better, and we need to think about what we can do differently and better.
The ideas of post-truth deconstruction, Tracy, a lot of the work that I do with people who are leaving evangelicalism, they really, that term, and it's an individual deconstruction, right? I'm deconstructing. And it really got me thinking about what you said and what John is speaking to, in thinking about, so when I'm in the classroom, let me give this example, and I'm teaching religion in America, oftentimes the students that are in my classrooms just assume where we are today is how things have just been, right? That this bifurcation, this partisanship of truth is this is just the way things are. And I always like it when students tell me, oh, you're talking about my grandparents, right? When we're talking about religion in America, that's not their reality, it's someone else's reality. And I'm wondering, what role do you think that the culture wars in America played in this situation where we find ourselves, where we're almost always talking about two interpretations of the truth, and then whether it's right, left, Republican, Democrat, everything from our consumer habits of whether you support Nike or Chick-fil-A get cataloged into one of these two sides, and it's always two competitive sides. Can you all, and that's an ill-formed question, but can you all speak to the culture wars and maybe what effects they've had on our understandings of truth?
Can I jump on this one, this grenade here first? So one of the things that we're kind of puzzling over right now, and we're still working through this, but I'm going to put it in very stark terms, and I'm speaking for myself here. I would say that the utility of the culture wars language is vastly diminished now. Mm. If you think about what the culture wars were in political terms, in many cases, yes, there have always been cultural dimensions to these, but in many cases, it was largely defined by these hot button issues. It was defined by things like abortion, death penalty, same-sex marriage, gun control, possibly. And it was never black and white, but you could draw the lines pretty starkly there. Those kinds of differences never presumed in any way the kind of differences about our interpretations of reality that we have today. Meaning those are really policy differences. And those are actually pretty healthy differences to have. It's good to have, and there were robust public policy debates about those issues. And you could understand why people felt really strongly about it. I mean, one of the things that made the culture wars was that these are big issues and people feel passionately about them and people think differently about them. They should be big issues. Now, if you want to politicize it and divide and drive all of your political party politics towards and around those, as also happened, it can lead to incredible ineffectiveness in government. So I don't mean to commend the culture wars in terms of the political sense. I think what we're seeing today is of a very, very different order. Those other issues have not gone away. They're not unimportant now, but the main kind of political divide I would describe today is, and we've talked about this, is a truth divide. Fundamental different understandings of reality. What happened and what didn't. The election was stolen. The election was not stolen. That's a fundamental divide in what has happened. You've got some cynical folks in the middle who are exploiting it, who know one thing but sort of don't want to tell the other side about that. And that's a very, very different place, and it's a very, very dangerous place. And I would say in a way that the culture wars were democratic. I mean, it's part of having a democracy is really robust debates. The truth divide is not democratic; it's anti-democratic. And I would say one of the strongest illustrations of that, a number of very principled conservatives, Republicans, who have just said no, no, no to the current drive of the Republican Party. It's a reminder that actually one side of that truth divide is bipartisan. It's people who were on the other side during the culture wars debates, but they have turned on this side and said, no, we simply cannot put, as much as we believe in these other issues, we can't put democracy below them. We have to recognize democracy and to prioritize truth.
Yeah, I want to emphasize what John says. If we can see our way out of this truth divide, I think we'll be in a position to find much more constructive footing in what we were calling for a long time, for too long, I think, the culture wars. And I have a slightly different view than John about the relationship between the culture wars and the truth divide. When that book came out, and I was a research assistant to the author, so I got to see it before most other people did. I was a smart alecky grad student, and I was sure this was dumb. It was so simple. How could anything be so simple? It was too black and white. And that quality of binary opposition of two sides opposed to one another in a culture conflict, a war, didn't seem to me to be very constructive or accurate. However, it was seized on first by the right. In 1992, at the Republican National Convention, Pat Buchanan said, "Oh my goodness, we're in a culture war." But then the left glommed onto it too and said, "Yeah, and we're on the right side of the culture war." And so that model, which was never very illuminating in my view, became a something that both the right and the left clung to, and manifested in a way that made it much more descriptively accurate than it had ever been at the beginning, right? So the way of sort of setting up political disagreement in terms of a charged binary of parties at war with one another set the stage for the ultimate binary, which is, this is true, this is false, assuming those positions in a very, what we've seen now is a potentially very violent kind of face-off. I think the culture wars never needed to be felt or lived or described in quite the way they were. The fact that they were, and that served left and right for so long, I think helps get us to the place we find ourselves now. I do want to underscore what John has said, which I find very important and very hopeful. And Arizona is a wonderful example of this, that those who have stood for truth and understand themselves as doing that and voting on those grounds have come from a broad political spectrum. So we had many conservatives coming out in favor of Joe Biden on that ground of the need to stand up for truth, the need to tell the truth. So let's restore truth, and then we can go back to figuring out how we are going to, deal with our differences about, the hot button issues. But we can't do anything. We can't do a thing if we can't rely on ourselves and one another to tell the truth.
Yeah, I agree entirely with what Tracy just said here. I think that's a great illustration of that, and the fact that even in the heyday of the culture wars, it still didn't fully describe where people are. I mean, there were countless studies of people where people were on abortion, and you would think the culture wars were defined by the 10% on either side who had the most strident views, and 60, 70% of the country was somewhere in the middle on a much grayer spectrum. But I think what's important to remember is that kind of division, that kind of tribalism that formed, coupled with gerrymandering, coupled with policy strategies that political parties undertake, that made culture war issues, especially abortion, made it kind of like a gateway drug. This is your entry into the hardened world of a tribe. Don't ever leave it. And not about fixing a problem. It's about identifying yourself and identifying your tribe. And when that tribe shifted, changed its colors under the truth divide, many didn't go anywhere with it because they didn't recognize any kind of shift in that divide.
Yeah, this idea of tribalism and gateway drugs, I really like that kind of analogy. I think within those identities as well, what I've seen in some of my research is that because it is so identity oriented and not truth oriented, being in those tribes, you often have to prove your fervor, right? You have to prove your identity of it. So it's almost who can go to the farthest regions of those things and stake claim. And so to stick with that, the kind of the health metaphor, I want us to think a little bit about what this means for us in our classrooms, particularly religious studies. A lot of our participants and a lot of the faculty in our society have a religious studies or theology background. I don't want to suggest that students didn't come into our classrooms with pre-existing opinions before, but it seems like what I've seen is, to get back to that tribalism and identity fervor, that students are coming in with pre-existing opinions and are anchored down harder to those opinions, right? There's something deeper, and they've staked their claim a little bit richer. Have you all been able to, in this project, think about what religious studies resources, theology resources, or just resources in higher education might be useful in as we come into classrooms talking about religion and truth during this time?
Well, I'll start by saying that I think it's a really important time to be a scholar and teacher of religion, and that that there's a hunger to think about and learn about this, learn about the role of religion, particularly in public life. And I've seen and experienced this in a few different ways. Let me start with a very concrete illustration. For many years, I've taught a class about religion, sort of an inquiry into religion and conflict, looks at the relationship between religion and politics. And at some point or another in the course of the class, civil religion comes up, and we end up reading several kinds of accounts that turn out to be pretty critical of civil religion. For the first time this past fall, I actually assigned Bella's chapter on American civil religion first. Why it didn't occur to me to do that before, I don't ask. The reaction was extremely different. It was far more interesting and more fun to teach because there was now a segment of the class that had actually been shown this is an argument for something, not completely uncritical by any means, very thoughtful account, and then here are some critiques of it. And you actually had some real discussion engagement with the students rather than just sort of assuming, oh, that's bad. Now, right now, there's all sorts of conversation taking place about Christian nationalism. The lines between Christian nationalism and civil religion are blurry at best. I'd like to try to sharpen them, but it's important to really think about what work our terms are doing for us. And we have, as a field that has just obsessed with the definition of religion for the last 10 years at least, we don't always obsess as much or with as much care on some of the other kinds of terms that we use. I mean, what does Christian nationalism mean? Why is that a bad thing? What does civil religion mean? Or on whose account? We would never really accept the idea that there's religion and not religions, most of us. Why should we accept the idea that there's civil religion only in the singular rather than in the plural? So that's our job, is to really help people think about different possibilities of the kinds of themes and idioms and topics and issues that we devote our lives to.
I'm struck by something that came up earlier in the conversation about various, turns to different kinds of emphases in religious studies. Lived religion, postmodernism has left many of our students without anything to affirm. And as we know, as religious studies professors, many students who have never knew you could study religion in college come to us because they do have a desire to affirm something, right? A desire to know what to affirm, to make to understand theological kinds of vocabularies or ethical kinds of decision making, or to fulfill some kind of spiritual hunger that brings them there. And I worry that for too long we've been expert at one thing, and that is telling those students they're in the wrong place. If they're there because they have some kind of spiritual yearning, or because they're interested in God, or because they want to know how to tell right from wrong, we tell them wrong classroom. And so I think we need to figure out how to do that better, how to welcome those students and their questions and their needs better, because certainly when we see not just students, but people from all age groups gravitating toward conspiracy theories or groups like QAnon, very often they do so because they have a kind of vacuum, in their lives that this fills so abundantly. There, I think a lived religion approach is the right one. If you can work with students to see what would draw someone toward religious nationalism or toward conspiracy thinking, and step back and ask ethnographic kinds of questions, I think that can be very, very effective in maybe helping students make sense of this and maybe see some parts of themselves or some people they know in some of these moves, and then learn to think perhaps more critically, or get some critical distance on those moves. At the same time, I think we can't pretend students don't come to our classrooms looking for some kind of spiritual nourishment, and to say, sorry, wrong classroom, or that's not what I do. I think we are abdicating a very important responsibility.
One of the things I would just a quick coda on this, the division, if you were to sketch this out in the oversimple terms, between religious studies on one side and theology on the other, is, Tracy sort of charted out the religious studies, the focus on lived religions, how people really live. Theology saying, okay, what does the text say? What is scripture? What were the theological debates that led up to this, et cetera? And neither side really talking to the other in some ways, each saying, well, that's not what real religion is. Either it's not really what is in the text, it's what people do, or saying, well, that's not what they're doing, isn't in the text, or isn't part of the history. There's a middle ground here. I mean, people do certain things because they have beliefs about them, but sometimes people do things that are quite contrary to the beliefs. And if you're not paying attention to both the lived religion as well as the theological beliefs behind or not behind and consistent with, then we're continuing to perpetuate what is unfortunately an artificial divide, I think, within the study of religion broadly between those two wings, if you will.
I agree. I just want to say, what a missed opportunity for us to pretend that those are two opposing camps or two opposing sides, as though lived religion never existed until we started studying it, right, in the last several decades. Of course, people always lived with their beliefs. Belief is a practice. Theological inquiry is a practice. That separation feels very arbitrary.
Yeah, hearing you both speak, I'm reminded that religious studies over the last few decades anyways has been a greatly self-reflective, self-critical field. Even trying to wrestle over what is religion and whether it exists or whether it's a colonial kind of creation and what that means. And so now what I'm hearing is somewhat that you are calling religious studies scholars to a different type of reflection, to consider in some ways how we've alienated aspects of truth, theology, and whether those are related in our field and in our studies and in our classrooms. Speaking more broadly, and I know Arizona State University has such a huge emphasis on public engagement. Do you all, have you seen in this project, or can you imagine ways, particularly that religious studies scholars can more broadly engage with the community and what that maybe looks like at several places, I guess, across the nation?
We have fellows in the program drawn from all different parts of the university, but 4 or 5 of them come from the Cronkite School, the journalism school. And journalism is a very big piece of the project. So we're interested, and our conversations are wonderful. I mean, really, I think those are some of the most vibrant exchanges in our seminars. But one of the things that I think we've seen over the last month, several weeks, is a real need for better journalism about religion. The best public-facing writing on religious symbolism in the Capitol insurrection has come from religious studies scholars. There are some journalists who can do it pretty well, but religious studies scholars have really been filling that picture in, and it's such a rich and terrifying picture. And so I see that as a place where our skills, our ways of noticing, really were called upon in a way that allowed us to be in a larger conversation, a very critical conversation.
Yes, and this project has, in some ways, built on other ones that we've done that have tried to bring scholars of religion and journalists who are interested in religion into the same room to talk with one another. In some cases, to appreciate what the other trade and profession does, what it doesn't do, what its standards of excellence are, and also to form a little bit of solidarity, because these are both institutions, the academy and journalism, that have been under attack, continue to be under attack in many ways. Elite institutions, manufacturers of liberal culture, people that are warping our children's minds or poisoning the public's understanding with their fake news, et cetera. And that is a very new phenomena. So we've all, journalists and religion scholars, and frankly, every institution of civil society and of government, have got to take what I call a whole of America approach here, and get on board with backing democracy and standing up for democracy again. And that means doing it in the classroom at times. It doesn't mean we can't think critically about democracy. We're going to read Plato. He does not advocate for democracy, but he gives you a pretty good warning as to why he thinks democracy is not a good idea, as it can lead to tyranny. Well, that gives us something to think about too, doesn't it now? So I think, it's not just yes, we need to engage within the classroom. We're educating future citizens. We need to engage outside of the classroom with current citizens. But we also need to think about how we engage. And do we simply engage as scholar experts, as people who have a specific set of knowledge? Maybe that's important at certain times. But we might also engage as scholars who live in democracies. The way that we engage as scholars who live in democracies is going to look different than a scholar who does not live in a democracy. And we need to be more embracing of that and affirming of that, I think. There's a lot of freedoms that come with that, freedoms we sometimes take for granted. But we should relish those freedoms, and it's not just relish the freedoms it gives us as individuals, restraints, but it gives us freedoms to do things as well.
I don't know if either one of you saw this, and we do. Before I lose track, let me encourage all of our participants to please use the Q&A function or the chat function to ask questions. And we do have one question from Jeff Hoover that I do want to get to. I recently heard Eddie Glaude talk about the role of higher education, and he said something to the effect of, and this isn't a direct quote by any means, but that yes, it is about knowledge, but we've forsaken in many ways our role in understanding that higher education is really about the formation of the self, and that many of the people who walk into our classrooms, we are helping them understand who they are in a particular context and who they want to be. And I just really, really like that. And as both of you are speaking and thinking about broadening out that private-public divide of we are helping our fellow citizens also understand who they are at this moment. And I do want to speak about that maybe just a little bit, but I do want to get to Jeff's question. And he simply wants to know, can you all cite some of the examples or maybe even some of the authors who are writing right now about what is it? Is it called insurrection religion or siege religion or something? I think is on Twitter what I'm seeing it's called, about the attack on the Capitol and how religion symbolically or I guess instrumentally played a role in that.
Yeah, Peter Manzo, who is the curator for religion at the Museum of National History, had a piece in the Washington Post, I think yesterday, on religious symbolism in the Capitol. He also is one of these people who must have a clone because he's on Twitter 24 hours a day. And he's been curating these threads under the hashtag Capitol Siege Religion. And you can see lots of people who are contributing to this discussion. Sarah Posner, who's one of our Recovering Truth Fellows, has been publishing on this. Jeff Charlotte has been publishing on it. Kelly Baker, who a religious studies scholar 10 years ago published a book on the Klan, is now, of course, very much in demand to help us make sense of this. And there's an interview with her in the New York Times yesterday or the day before. So that's a list to get you started.
Yeah, Robert Jones, I would add to that, had a piece pretty early when he came out. And, even more important than the people, which these are all great folks, the outlets that are talking about this too, particularly checking, Religion News Service has done a lot on this. I think Religion Dispatches has done some things as well.
Yeah, those are all great resources, and many of the people you list have wonderful books out there. I'm thinking Robert Jones, The End of White Christian America, who was preemptively recognizing a lot of what was going on with his sociological data. And then Sarah, what is Sarah Posner's book?
Unholy.
Unholy. Yeah. Very, very good. And if you're interested in the religious right, the historical, the deep diving she does in there, that I think is very, very important. We did get another question from Daniel Sack, and he says, you have raised rich intellectual and religious issues, but some of this conflict is also driven by a search for profit and political power. How can the Academy address that?
What a great question. When I think about Eddie Glaude's point about spiritual formation, I'll just call it that, which is part of our job as scholars, I think one of the places where we've been thwarted in that part of our vocation, part of our work, is the drive in universities to monetize degrees, to actually put a dollar value to some of these degrees. And of course, in our moment of economic precarity, it's, you would never, ever dismiss those concerns. What can I do with a religious studies degree? What can I do with a liberal arts degree? But I think that we have given pride of place in the academy to profit making in all kinds of ways, all kinds of ways. Who funds our research? How can we be entrepreneurs? That's a big one at ASU. And so I think if we're going to think about our job as a kind of spiritual formation at the level of the individual and the society, we need to think about how to expand that vision beyond profit in the university, to certainly consider economic precarity carefully from many perspectives in a helpful, constructive way, but not to assign dollar values to the stuff that we're trying to impart to students. That would be a big step, a big first step.
I'll just add, I agree entirely with that. And we probably focus most in this kind of a setting on what we can do within the institutional contexts in which we operate. If you want to hear what I have to say about politics, you can follow me on Twitter, and I'll have plenty of things about what need to be done or who needs to say what. The recovering truth in politics is the theme of our project this year. We're going to be focusing much more on the academy next year, but we do have to have some fundamental changes in our political culture, and I don't want to. Money is part of that, although I don't. What I guess I would say is that it's too easy of a thing to say it's about money, or it's about gerrymandering, or it's about public education. It's about a lot of these things. Mm-hmm. And we need some collective energies to think about them holistically, synthetically, how they're going to work together, and what each of us can do within our different institutional contexts and our own lives to work towards a culture that simply relishes truth, that esteems it, and says this is something that's part of our public commons. We have to have this. We can't have a society without it.
Since you mentioned this, John, would you be willing to share your Twitter handle real quickly, just in case somebody did want to follow you?
Sure.
And then
I'm at John D. Carlson, and we have a Recovering Truth Twitter account at Recovering Truth.
And I follow both of you, and I'm somewhat active. It's really hard for me on Twitter sometimes. There are a lot of rabbit holes that you can find yourself going down, and so I try to limit some of that. And so
Good for you, Terry.
Yeah, I try. For those listening, you can actually install blockers on your browsers that limit how long you spend on those websites. That are free, so might be a useful tool. But it does bring up a question about social media at this moment as we're talking. Well, John, I think you're exactly right. There's so many relevant aspects to what we're talking about with this conversation that comes to this. I recently saw that. I don't know if you all saw the articles, but a lot of the people who were at the Capitol siege didn't vote, and then two, that many of them had been out of work and unemployed for a while. And so those are, different kinds of stressors that people have on them at this moment. And social media, whether that's Twitter, whether that's Facebook, whether that was Parler, really offers an opportunities for people to find their tribe, so to speak, to get back to that language. And then Twitter seems to be, I think, a great kind of academic resource for news articles, publications, et cetera. But at the same time, Twitter was the primary platform for former President Trump. What do y'all have any sense in the political turmoil we find ourselves of the role that social media, and maybe you don't, it's okay to say you don't here, but that social media has played in this thing, in this entire discussion of truth at this moment?
Well, social media algorithms don't reward truth, right? They reward engagement. And it's much more, what is the saying? A lie can go around the world 3 times while truth is still lacing its shoes or something. Lies catch on and become viral and attractive myths, attractive stories that are laced with untruths are much more likely to reach broad numbers of people on social media. So the medium itself is perfectly suited to worsen all of the problems that we see, to make untruths very attractive, to make it a space of belonging, belonging to a QAnon. Truth is the last thing. Well, truth has a very different valence, I think, in that space. It's not about finding the truth so much as it's about being part of a community, having a kind of a very charged mission, a sense of belonging to something that is really epic. Why were all of those insurrectionists taking incriminating selfies? Because they were making history. They were a part of history. So the idea that you are, by belonging to a group founded on a lie, or a group founded on conspiracies, the big lie, QAnon, all of these overlapping spaces and communities, that gives people a rich sense of belonging that really isn't available in a pandemic. Certainly, I think I was reading somewhere that Facebook usage increased sixfold during the pandemic. So we're just online. I mean, this is how we do everything now. So spaces that might have nurtured us in real life are now all moved online. So that's a big problem. I think, though, that and Terry, you and I have both experienced this on Twitter. We can be in a social media environment feeling like we're getting something valuable, getting something important, and at the same time we realize that this very environment is just eviscerating our psychic lives of all that we found valuable, prior to this shift into online modes of being and being together and communicating with one another. So that's a problem. I mean, the medium is a problem. The supply of these conspiracy theories and untruths is a problem. But I think an even bigger problem is the demand for them. And the demand for them is fed by, I think these sorts of these experiences of sort of emptiness and lack of belonging, lack of any kind of mooring in an environment that is so saturated with information of all kinds. Where do you stand? How do you make sense of anything? Who are you? What is your identity? Social media can give you that place to stand, and a group founded on a lie or founded on a conspiracy theory can give you a very important identity and a very important role in that environment, which otherwise might be unavailable to you. And so it just gets worse.
One thing I guess I would add, and I agree entirely with what Tracy said there, there are a couple hopeful things that are worth at least, flagging here. One thing that something like Twitter allows me to do are to follow views of people I'm not, especially in a pandemic, in contact with, or with folks who come from very different kinds of walks of life, different backgrounds, different races, different religions, different ethnicities, et cetera. And if it's just following to sort of engage to see where you have something in common with someone, even if it's something stupid, like you both really liked that picture, the gif of the otter sliding down the hill in the snow. I mean, that can be a kind of a connection, a form of community in a way, online, et cetera. Not rich, not rigorous, but you realize, okay, we do still have some things in common. And you can also find some people out there you just never would have had any contact with. And you're like, wow, I just love to hear what's on her mind when she wakes up in the morning. Wow, that's really interesting. There are also some somewhat positive signs. They've been slow coming, but we did see some positive signs of things that Facebook and Twitter have both done, particularly specifically about addressing election fraud, trying to minimize election interference. There's a very famous interview that Mark Zuckerberg gave when he says, we don't see it as our role to arbitrate between truth. And that's about the worst thing that the head of any organization could ever say. Because once you've given up the idea of truth, then we're lost. It's part of that global commons. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to argue about what's true and false, that we're not going to debate things, or that we're going to have, we aren't going to have very different interpretations. That's not, but things that we patently know are false, that ultimately Facebook, Twitter, other social media companies finally said, no, we can't allow this to just recirculate and continue to make people think that, oh, just because they've seen it here. Newspapers don't do that. Newspapers have very rigorous standards. Not saying that a social media company has to have the same kind of standards, but there are, again, certain things that you don't have to fact check against 3 other sources and say, nope, we've proved this. We know these things. Again, if you're a social media company that's based in a democracy, your operation, your rules, your reach, your mission should look very different than if you're a social media company based in China, Russia, and other places like that. So we've seen some improvements there. Again, what does it mean to live in a democracy? To be whoever it is I am, or to be part of this institution in a democracy.
Yeah, I wonder if we could end. We just have a couple of minutes, and just very briefly, many of us are thinking about what life looks like post-pandemic, and so kind of a future-oriented question. What's the future of this project? Where do you see that it's going? And just in a couple of minutes, so we can respect your time.
Well, as John said, we have 2 more years after this one. This was our sort of online year, so we hope we'll be back in, gathering in rooms and restaurants and classrooms together by fall. We'll focus on religion in the academy and truth in the academy and truth in culture in those next 2 years. So we're looking forward to that, to bringing new voices in. And one of the things that has been immensely gratifying to me is just to see how, I don't have to convince myself that this project is important. I mean, every time you turn around, you see why this project is critical. And it's been gratifying to bring lots of voices together to talk about this, to have an academic project that is very much, very much alive in spaces outside of academia. So we hope to just continue that, to continue to give energy to conversations that are incubated in the center, in our space, but that then have a life beyond that.
Yeah, I agree very much. It's nice to be able to say that, to be able to describe your project in 2 words, recovering truth. And that's all we have to say. People get it. Academics are not used to doing that most of the time with our work. The other thing is that academics can be a little bit on the proprietary side. And with this project, the more the merrier. We want everyone who wants to be involved to be involved. So there is no limit. This is open. We have a completely open borders approach in our project. We all benefit from it. And the last thing I'll say is just that in addition to recovering truth in the academy next year, we've got our group of journalists who's going to be thinking about that within the context of media as well. The challenges of operating and what kinds of rules or differences, different rules might need to be in place, or different approaches need to be considered in the current environment in which, the media have been labeled the enemy of the people.
Yeah. Listen, John and Tracy, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your work. This is hearing more about it. It's absolutely, at this moment in our history, is invaluable. What you're doing, and then also what you're calling others to do. For anybody who's listening, who would like more information, I think a simple internet search for Arizona State University's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict will provide you information about this particular project, but then also the many numerous and wonderful projects that the center does. Thanks again for everybody who tuned in, and particularly for John and Tracy for your time. We wish you the best in this project, and hopefully we can hear more about it.
Thank you, Terry, so much. And you can just Google Recovering Truth. It'll pop right up.
You'll find us. Yeah. Thank you so much, Terry. What a pleasure. This is great. Thanks.
Thanks to everyone who tuned in too. Thank you.
Yep.